Excellencies, dear colleagues, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening to who is with us on WebEx and to who is now or later watching this video. The Geneva Environment Network has the pleasure to welcome you today virtually for a special event looking at the ambitions for the Chemicals and Waste Cluster in the 8th replenishment of the Global Environmental Facility Trust Fund. For those who still don't know our platform, we are a network of more than 100 institutions and secretariats based in Geneva that make this region one of the global hubs for environmental governance. Administrated by the United Nations Environment Programme and supported by Switzerland, we organize various networking activities, including regular multi-stakeholder roundtables and briefings on major environmental trends. Chemicals and waste is an important topic for International Geneva. Indeed, Geneva is the major hub for global governance of chemicals and waste, with the presence of 4 chemicals and waste conventions, the Secretariat of the Strategic Approach to International Chemicals Management, or SICAM, and other global actors working towards eliminating pollution. Therefore, there is a particular interest for the stakeholders following this process from Geneva to look into the Global Environment Facility, or GEF, priorities on chemicals and waste as one of the main mechanisms supporting their implementation. And this is why we have co-convened this event with the actors I have just mentioned. For this special event, we are bringing virtually to Geneva and beyond the CEO and chairperson of the GEF, Carlos Manuel Rodriguez. We have also with us today the Executive Secretary of the Basel, Rotterdam and Stockholm Conventions, Rolf Payet, as well as the Executive Secretary of the Minamata Convention on Mercury, Monica Stunkirich, and to represent the SICAM Secretariat, the Director of the United Nations Environment Programme Economy Division, Sheila Agarwal Khan. To support the GEF CEO, we have also with us Anil Sukhdeo, Coordinator for Chemicals and Waste for the GEF programs. And finally, today's chair and moderator is His Excellency Ambassador Franz Beres, Switzerland's Ambassador for the Environment. Before I turn to him, let me remind you that the documents presented, the summary, as well as the video of the event will be made available as usually on the webpage of this event. The link will be shared or has already been shared in the chat. Throughout the event, you can raise your questions by using the Q&A box. We will use your questions to feed the discussion after the presentations. It is our pleasure to turn now to His Excellency Ambassador Franz Beres to open the event.
Thank you very much. And let me first thank the Jen and you, Diana, for organizing this event. The GEF replenishment is in a critical phase, thus it is very timely to discuss the expectations, ambitions, and the needs that the chemicals and waste clusters may have and should have with regard to the GEF. I would also like to warmly welcome all of you to today's event on chemicals, waste, and the GEF replenishment. And most importantly, also thank all the panelists and participants for being today with us and sharing their perspectives and expertise with us. The aim of today's session is to discuss what can and needs to be achieved for chemicals and waste policy implementation with adequate financing. The implementation of the Chemicals and Waste Convention is key to achieve sustainable development, and therefore it is also absolutely critical to secure their financing. This is important in the context of the ongoing GEF replenishment negotiations and also for the future. Indeed, as said, chemicals and waste management is a perfect example for sustainable development. Much of our well-being, prosperity, and health would not be possible without chemicals. At the same time, the unsound chemicals management and the waste that is created with chemicals leads to massive environmental problems, health risks, and typically the poorest and most disadvantaged are most harmed. But finally, the sound management of chemicals and waste also offers great economic perspectives and income. In short, chemicals and waste management ideally brings together and represents and touches all dimensions of sustainable development. Therefore, it is really important that we make everything that the legally binding instruments that have been established in this context can be fully implemented. And this needs, of course, also financial support for those who need such support for the implementation. The GEF is part of the financial mechanisms of the Stockholm Convention and of the Minamata Convention. And the implementation of those conventions can only be ensured if the financial mechanism fulfills its critical role. Therefore, the GEF has to measure, track and report the results of the GEF projects towards achieving the objectives of the conventions. A key purpose of the GEF is to support of countries to meet their obligations under various multilateral agreements, including, of course, the Stockholm and the Minamata Convention. We therefore have to ensure that implementation can be achieved with the GEF support. It is about the sound management of chemicals and waste in all countries and to ensure the well-functioning and credibility of the global treaties and of the GEF in fulfilling its role. Living in the 21st century, we inhabit a world where chemicals and waste regulated under the Chemicals and Waste Conventions are everywhere. There are hundreds and thousands of chemicals on the market, and almost all products we use daily contain chemicals. We have to ensure that these chemicals are managed soundly and that all products are safe. Moreover, there are also several legacy issues that need to be solved in many countries. For example, there are stocks of PCBs and we need to destroy in order to achieve the goals of the Stockholm Convention. The current draft of the GEF 8 programming strategy proposes a shift from a traditional focal area-based approach to a more integrated approach, addressing the drivers of environmental degradation and generating multiple environmental benefits at the same time. This leads to a shift of funding from the chemicals and waste focal area to the so-called integrated programs. This transition can have positive impacts, but we also see the risk that funding for certain elements of the implementation of the conventions could become insufficient. Fully addressing the PCB issues or other legacy issues, for example, might become more difficult. But we have to finally address unresolved issues once and for all. The cost of inaction is very high, and we all know this, and therefore it is important that the enhanced integration will generate more global benefits for the entire chemicals and waste cluster and not run at the cost of the Chemicals and Waste Convention implementation. It is also expected that the more integrated programming approach duly considers the integrations between chemicals and waste, climate change, ocean pollution, and biodiversity loss. An important step will be to increase the availability of funding for the entire chemicals and waste clusters in GEF 8 to meet our shared goals on ridding the world of the chemicals and waste that pollute our oceans and contribute to a biodiversity loss, in particular in the context of climate change. Now we have the opportunity to initiate innovative programming that leverages investments in climate change, biodiversity, and combats land and ocean degradations while ensuring progress in the implementation of the Chemicals and Waste Conventions in line with the guidance developed by these conventions. And I think this is a good, this is an interesting context in which it is now really interesting to hear the colleagues intervening and presenting their views on that relationship between the GEF 8 replenishment and chemicals and waste management. It is now my pleasure to hand over the floor to Carlos Manuel Rodriguez, the GEF CEO, as our first panelist of this session. Over to you, Carlos.
Well, thank you so much, Ambassador. It is my great pleasure to be today with all of you in this timely event, even though we continue under the shadow of this devastating COVID-19 pandemic. I would like to thank Rolf and Monica for the invitation and organizing this event. As you probably all know, I joined the GEF in June 2020. Since then, I've had the opportunity to engage closely with both Rolf and Monica and their team on the work on chemicals and waste and the importance of this work in preventing irreversible harm to human health and ecosystems. I strongly believe, Ambassador, that never in my professional life I've seen such a very strong alignment within the political community and the scientific community in recommendations. the sense of urgency, the evidence, the science, the work that we have done throughout the years are great, fabulous enabling conditions for us to really upscale and move the needle in terms of not just achieving successfully the goals and targets from the chemicals and waste convention, but also really move the needle in terms of a more sustainable consumption and production level at the consumption and production model at the global level. You all know that the GEF was established 30 years ago to tackle our planet's most pressing environmental problems. Since then, it has become the largest and most experienced multilateral trust fund dedicated to helping developing countries to protect and restore nature, address climate change, and just very importantly, deal with all the different pollution challenges. Our financing and policy support has proven to enable the vulnerable and developing countries to prioritize environmental action with a global impact. This includes the implementation of international conventions on biodiversity, climate change, chemical desertification, but also, and very importantly, at the national and regional level, we work with countries on forest, land use, ocean, waterways, wildlife, and waste. So the GEF brings together 184 member governments in addition to civil society, international organizations, private sector partners. And yes, in the last 30 years, we have been able to mobilize around $22 billion in grants, an additional 120 billion in co-financing for more than 5,000 projects in around 150 nations. For the audience here, let me also inform you that the GEF funds are replenished every 4 years. In the last replenishment cycle, the GEF 7 raised around $4.1 billion. Currently, the GEF is going through its very important aid replenishment cycle, which will allow us to program from 2022 to 2026. So far, we have held 2 replenishment meetings with the GEF donors and key representatives. During these 2 replenishment meetings, we have negotiated very detailed and robust programming and policy directions. We will be having our 3rd replenishment meeting, which will take place from the 2nd to the 4th of February. And our 4th and last meeting will take place in the next April. Thus, this event today could not be more timely, given that we're only a few weeks away from our discussions on our recently updated programming strategy and policy directive in this, the 3rd replenishment meeting with our donors. So after 30 years of working to protect and conserve the environment, the GEF aid replenishment comes at a critical point in time where the decisions made today will have significant impact, for good or for bad, in the future. So we must strive to act now to steer away from a catastrophe. The task is not easy, it is difficult, and the need is great. But I believe that we can do it, working together with a common purpose and, yes, of course, a shared vision. You may think that the GEF funding, about $1 billion per year, is tiny compared to the scale of the global needs. And, I agree with that impression. But our impact to date has come from bringing together government, civil society, and private sector leaders in support of high-impact solutions to the roots of the environmental degradation, not just on their systems. So a strong GEF aid replenishment will thus enable us to scale high-impact initiatives that support global environmental benefits in a more efficient way. To that end, over the last year, the GEF team and I have been working tirelessly along with donors and recipients of the GEF to develop an ambitious strategy to build back better in a way that nature becomes positive. We really move towards a net zero carbon world and yes, a pollution-free one. And this is in the center of what we look at GEF 8, but also in the context of the longer strategic vision into the GEF 9 and beyond. It goes without saying that the foundation of the GEF 8 strategy is the guidance from the convention that the GEF serves, but also builds on our unique role as the financial mechanism of 5 conventions and long experiences with integrated programming to address the key drivers of environmental degradation, which includes a strong focus on transformational change of key economic systems to reverse degradation. Our upcoming third replenishment meeting will be critically important because it's the first time that the replenishment group will comment on the results that we're hoping to achieve through our ambitious programming. And the meeting will also consider resource allocation proposals for the first time. The chemical and waste needs have been highlighted by many countries during their replenishment as a particularly important area of the GEF work, requiring increased resources in GEF 8. And we are, of course, hearing the same from the conventions themselves. For example, we have paid great attention to the recent need assessment put out by the Stockholm Convention, which we received after the COP10 in July last year. You will see that the chemical and waste strategy in GEF 8 is significantly more ambitious and is structured to build on the momentum of GEF 6 and GEF 7, which are on track to eliminate over 200,000 tons of POPs, mercury, and highly hazardous pesticides, safely manage and dispose over 4 million tons of polluted waste and contaminated materials, and reduce over 2 million tons of plastic to enter the ocean. The GEF 8 strategy promotes more integration within the cluster and across the GEF focal areas and adopts a supply chain approach to prevent the future buildup of harmful chemicals in the environment. Neil, my colleague and lead on chemicals at the GEF, will elaborate further on this in a few minutes. Also, it is important to highlight that the results will be one focus of our third replenishment meeting in a few weeks. On results, the chemicals and waste are proposed to be achieved in 2 ways. One, directly from chemicals and waste resources, and second, as scope benefits for the impact programs in other focal areas. This has allowed for a higher target than we would have been able to achieve from only our focal area resources. There is also an ambitious resource package that is being presented at the third replenishment meeting. While it is far too early to know where we will end up in terms of allocation, in every scenario that the replenishment will have in front of them, there's a significant increase for chemicals and waste because we know there are great needs in this area. As we all know, the GEF funding will never be enough, which is why we have designated the GEF 8 strategy to attract even greater interest and buy-in from the private sectors, which we have learned from our GEF 6 and GEF 7 programming. The approach that we are taking on supply chains is designed to incorporate private sector for the greater outcomes that we could ever achieve with only working with the public sector. So we have an enormous amount of work to do over the GEF 8 and GEF 9 period on POPs, mercury, and sound management of chemicals and waste. We hope and I believe that we have designed a strategy that will address the need of the countries and the obligations of the conventions in an integrated way that propels us forward to our collective goals. Now, I would like to give the floor to my colleague, Anil Sudel, our lead on chemicals in the GEF, to provide you with further details on the chemicals and waste strategy for GEF 8. Thank you so much. Muchas gracias.
So thank you, Carlos Manuel. Again, it's a pleasure to be here today to share with you some additional details of the GEF 8 programming directions, particularly on chemicals and waste. As Carlos Manuel pointed out, the strategy has the ambition to set the foundation and be relevant all the way to 2030, in other words, to GEF 8 and GEF 9. So GEF has a unique mandate of managing the elimination of chemicals pollution, biodiversity conservation and protection, mitigation of climate change, prevention of land degradation, and protection of international waters. And as Carlos went into the global drivers for these, I won't go into those again, but I would add that chemical pollution is driven by every economic sector, and without addressing pollution, the resilience of ecosystems will suffer, as well as human health will continue to be compromised. In terms of how we design the strategy, particularly for chemicals and to respond to the chemicals and waste conventions, we recognize that without addressing pollution, we cannot fully address environmental degradation. As such, we have ensured that clear linkages have been made in the GEF 8 proposal to guide programming in the next 4 years. The chemicals and waste portfolio has an increasing share of multi-chemical and multifocal area projects and programs, which brings more synergy and benefits to the chemicals cluster, promotes the sound management of chemicals and waste, and accrue benefits to other focal areas, including climate change, land degradation, and international waters. In addition to the robust results that Carlos Manuel mentioned that we've already been achieving since GEF 6, we've also seen that enhanced synergy in the cluster and alignment with other focal areas has facilitated programming to eliminate over 2 million tons of plastics from entering the oceans, restoring degraded land in mine sites and in agriculture, reduce carbon dioxide emissions from different industrial processes, bring in the private sector, not only as co-financers to GEF projects, but as partners working together to address pollution. We have also worked to unlock commercial financing to achieve better practices and technology to reduce hazardous pesticides in agriculture and create circular solutions for various things such as textiles, electronics, and plastics. As Carlos mentioned, our programming of the convention provides an entry point for the sound management of chemicals and brings in dedicated financing, support for policy and institutional change, and capacity building, and bringing in the private sector to work on the sound management of chemicals and waste. Some of our more recent examples are in the Islands program, which brings together 33 small island developing states to tackle pollution in key sectors and in supply chains, through strengthening policy, legislation, and capacity, and bringing in the private sector and unlocking donor finance, as well as another example, which is the FARM program, which works in 8 countries to address the use of hazardous chemicals in agriculture, including persistent organic pollutants and highly hazardous pesticides, as well as agricultural practices, by adapting practices to use non-hazardous or non-chemical practices and technologies, strengthening legislation and policy, sharing knowledge, and working with the pesticide producers and end users of agriculture. So in GEF 8, we fully expect to be able to build upon the lessons we've learned and expand on transforming key economic systems to eliminate as far as possible hazardous chemicals from the supply chain. So that's how we went into the thinking of developing the strategy. So in terms of the actual strategy, the GEF 8 chemicals and waste strategy builds upon what we've done in GEF 7 and GEF 6, and will work under the guidance of the chemicals conventions to address POPs, mercury, ozone-depleting substances, and some aspects of SICOM. But it is designed to work in a more coherent way that provides synergies across the focal area and with other focal areas and integrated approaches that are being proposed in GEF 8. A critical part of the strategy and its shift from just 7 is the adoption of a supply chain approach to prevent future buildup of harmful chemicals in the environment. By doing this, we hope to eliminate hazardous chemicals entering into the environment. Of course, we do still have legacy issues to deal with, such as PCBs, and Objective 3 of the GEF 8 Chemicals and Waste Strategy will cover legacy POPs, including PCBs, and the GEF is committed to supporting the 2025-2028 deadline of the Stockholm Convention. If a country prioritizes the safe disposal of PCBs to meet their phase-out targets, these, of course, will be covered by the GEF 8 strategy. In addition to eliminating the inflow of new hazardous chemicals and clean up old ones, we will continue to develop the enabling conditions within countries through policy, reform, and coherence, and capacity building, and improving access to technology, science, and knowledge. It looks small on my screen, but this is meant to illustrate just a tie into the broader agenda and how we've actually put together the GEF 8 strategy. And we should point out that the documents replenishment are posted, so you can look at those on the GEF website. To achieve our vision of preventing harmful chemicals, halting nature loss, ensuring that the world is on a carbon neutral and nature positive path by the end of the decade, we're proposing an ambitious set of 10 integrated programs that address all the drivers of environmental degradation, complemented by focal area strategies that will ensure that convention obligations are met. And how you should probably, or how we read this diagram, is that the IPs, which are on the left column, are providing results to the focal area, which are along the top, and provide those columns on the rest of the diagram. So that the IPs are intended to be designed to provide multiple benefits of the 5 environmental conventions we work on, plus international waters. The integrated programs can be seen to, as I said, deliver multiple global environmental benefits across all focal areas served by the GEF. And for chemicals, the expectation is that the results will accrue to the focal area from IPs without significant use of chemicals and waste resources, as we have already demonstrated in GEF 7. And to this end, we hope to deliver about 3 to 4 times the level of GEBs than we have been able to do in GEF 7. And this will ensure more impact in terms of results and a positive action for the environment. I think with that, I can end, and thank you again for your attention.
Thank you so much, Anil, for your intervention. And I just want to make a final concluding remark, which is the fact that last year, we received very valuable information from the convention regarding the financial needs. And this is extremely important. I just want to take 30 additional seconds to highlight the need to have more data and information about financial needs at the global, but also at the regional and national level. In GEF 8, we are proposing to increase the funding for chemical and waste from 20 to 53%, and that is great. But we need to be conscious that we can even double the allocation of resources for chemicals and waste in GEF 8, that will never be enough to really narrow the needs of the countries. I will strongly recommend to be able to do 2 things which are important. One, build on those efforts to really pinpoint the financial needs at the global level with regards to all conventions. And then began doing another task. It's not easy, but it's relevant, which is understanding how much domestic resources are being mobilized at the country level. With that, we will have a good sound economic information on needs, gaps, and how we can be able to work together through the strategic approach for more integration of chemical management, so we can develop the policy frameworks to promote a sound management of chemicals at the country level. I think that during GEF 8, we will need to work on the financial needs. How do we address the gaps? how do we assess how much resources are being mobilized by domestic resources at the country level? With that set of information, we can be even more strategic in how we design projects that can give us more policy coherence at the country level and can help us mobilize more efficiently domestic resources, because all countries are investing their public resources in the implementation of all conventions. So thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Carlos and Anil, for your perspectives. You started, Carlos, by highlighting that there is a convergence between the scientific and the political community, and that there is a need and a will indeed to move towards sustainable chemicals management and sustainable consumption production patterns. You were highlighting also the history of the GEF, its critical functions, its growth, and its significant contributions and impacts that it was having. And then you were informing about the GEF replenishment process, underlining the need and importance of a strong GEF 8 replenishment. Anil then was explaining the chemicals and waste strategies further, the integrated programs, the GEF 8 strategies, the environmental benefit it provides, and the need and political need to involve the private sector and to move to synergies and multiple benefits in implementing it. And again, I think your last comments, Carlos, was very important, highlighting that we have to look at the needs, at the gaps that exist, at the domestic potential, and to be strategic about the next steps when we now move towards the GEF 8 replenishment. Thank you very much for that. And with that, I would like to hand over to Rolf Pyatt, the Executive Secretary from the Stockholm Convention, to give us his perspective from the, well, not only the Stockholm, but also the Rotterdam and the Basel Convention Executive Secretary, and to give his perspective on this issue. Thank you very much. Over to you, Rolf.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Perez. And thank you so much, Jen, for organizing this very timely and important while the GEF 8 replenishment discussions and negotiations are ongoing. And of course, having this discussion here in Geneva is very important, as it gives an opportunity for missions and other international organizations in Geneva to also be aware of themselves on the progress that is being made in the GEF replenishment and the role the various chemicals and waste multilateral environment agreements are playing towards the replenishment. I will focus my presentation today on three main issues. The first one is the implications of the outcomes of the triple BRS COPs, which was held online this year in July. The need for ability for the chemicals and waste cluster, both at the policy level, but also at the national, local levels, and also within the different stakeholders, such as the private sector and other community organizations. And finally, I'd like to elaborate on the importance of measuring the results and impact of our work in implementation of the GEF projects, as these are critical elements in measuring the effectiveness of the methods we are using, the implementation modalities, and all this. And I think Anil, in his last slide, talked a little bit about this. So let's start about the outcomes of the online COPs last July. As you all know, over 160 parties from the Basel, Rotterdam and Stockholm Conventions joined online, and they took essential decisions to ensure the continued work of the three conventions, but for the fifth review of the financial mechanism of the Stockholm Convention, and of course the report of the funding needs, which Carlos Manuel referred to implement the Stockholm Convention for the period 2020 to 2026. In summary, the review of the financial mechanism concluded that although the GEF has responded adequately to the COP decisions of the Stockholm Convention, the financial resources for persistent organic pollutants in the GEF has not been commensurate with the evolution and progress of the Stockholm Convention, meaning that there are a number of chemicals that being listed at every COP, and we need to also prioritize this within, of course, the limited funding that's available within the allocation for chemicals and waste. Of course, this is of concern to parties as we have the 2025 and 2028 guidelines set out. There will be significant resources required to phase out and address PCBs. And right now, with the current replenishment levels, we have some concerns. The outcomes of the needs assessment report for GEF 8 also suggests that we need about $5 billion to protect people and environment from persistent organic pollutants. That's a very huge sum. And almost half of that will be needed for us to address PCBs. So there is a need for us to put our heads together, put our resources together to see how we can achieve significant progress over the next 3 to 4 years. The second point I wanted to focus on is the cross-cutting considerations that we need to increase our visibility on the chemicals and waste cluster in other areas and in the integrated programming. I see with concern the fact that most of the and we should explore how we can increase those contributions significantly so that we can actually then measure the impacts of those contributions once we've actually implemented those integrated programs. And as referred to by Ambassador Perez, the integrated programs is an essential way for us to both synergize, but also optimize and also engage a wide range of stakeholders from different sectors and from biodiversity, from climate change and other sectors in addressing the issue of chemicals and waste, as all these key global issues are very much integrated and linked. So pollution from the unsound management of chemicals indeed is the driver for these kinds of long-lasting environmental degradation. And therefore, we need to see how we those. In GEF 8 and 9, the continued focus of the GEF on integrated approaches and cross-cutting programming is also, as I said before, very much welcome and has the potential to ensure the most effective and efficient use of GEF resources. By fostering cross-cutting programming between chemicals and waste and other GEF focal areas, it will help us to mitigate the impact of pollution on climate change as well, and to reduce the loss of biodiversity. So we need to actually also showcase some of these results. We have to show what works, what doesn't work, what we've learned, and how this can be scaled up, how this can be duplicated, replicated, how this can be, solved in the most cost-efficient way. And I think there's a lot of opportunities there for us under GEF 8 for us to make progress in those areas as well. Can learn from successes in other regions, especially dealing with the complexities. With the increasing complexities of cross-cutting approaches, we need to better understand how chemicals and waste and POPs work supports the integrated program, and at the same time achieve the targets set for chemicals and waste focal area. This is very important because we can have these great integrated programs, but if at the end of the day we cannot measure and specifically point to those achievements which relate to the targets or to the decisions made by the parties of the Stockholm Convention, then we will have to go back and redesign the project more or less. To be effectively measured. So we would highly appreciate the establishment of a group on knowledge management and communication across the whole chemicals and waste cluster. We understand that the meetings of the group were less frequent than in pre-corona times, but we look forward to continuing and pursuing this important work, as fruitful discussions in that group has allowed us, both in terms of as the convention to measure the effectiveness of the Stockholm Convention, but also with implementing agencies for them to ensure when they develop projects, they put in the right criteria, the right indicators to ensure that we can measure the effectiveness of our work on the ground. So I will stop here, Your Excellency, and looking forward to hearing from my distinguished colleagues, Monica and Sheila, from the Minamata and Stockholm Secretariats, respectively. And thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Rolf, for outlining the perspective from the chemicals and waste perspective, outlining the outcomes of the last triple COPs that were organized last July virtually, for the needs of the visibility and the support for the chemicals and waste cluster, and for the importance of measuring results and impacts. And indeed also not only for outlining the concerns with regards to, but also the potential of the integrated approach. And as you were highlighting, it is really important to measure the results and the impacts and to learn from what could be done and not could be achieved through the new approach by the GEF. And finally, also thank you for your proposal to establish a group for collecting and managing this knowledge and lessons learned in order to do better then and do increasingly better with each step in our way forward. Thank you very much, Rolf. And with that, I would like to hand over to Monica Stunkirich, who is Executive Secretary of the Minamata Convention. Over to you, Monica.
Thank you so much. Good day to everyone. I hope you can hear me well. And I would like to begin by expressing my gratitude to both Franz and Carlos Manuel, and also, of course, to Diana for having this discussion today. I'm glad to be a fellow speaker together with you and also with Rolf, Sheila, and Anil. And of course, congratulations again to GEF for your 30th anniversary during this year. Our parties has been very clear and quite vocal on the importance of GEF aid to the full implementation of the Minamata Convention and to overcoming challenges related to deadlines of the convention that are set to reduce or eliminate emissions and use of mercury from across sectors. And full implementation is realistic. The Minamata Convention is achievable. When its text was negotiated, countries came together around a sensible and achievable set of obligations. Convention implementation has also excellent momentum in its early years, and now it's time to fully invest and help parties to get it right. The work we must invest in has a dual imperative, health and nature. Just last year, you may have heard, the WHO Director General released new estimates on the public health impact of chemicals. The trend is going into the wrong direction. 2 million lives and 53 million disability-adjusted life years were lost in 2019 due to chemicals exposure, and this is likely an undercount. Mercury and other chemicals has numerous impacts and dependencies upon natural capital and ecosystem services, which are not captured in traditional financial accounting. In order to conserve and enhance ecosystem services globally, the depletion of natural capital due to mercury and other chemicals must be assessed across the economic sectors. In this regard, the aid replenishment of GEF Trust Fund is a key part in emphasizing the need to quantify and evaluate the environmental and social costs of mercury emissions and releases. At least I would like to say it that way. In short, implementation of the obligations of the convention will produce socioeconomic benefits and will be essential to realizing the full potential of ecosystem services. Our parties do recognize the role that action on mercury can and must play in overcoming the interconnected challenges of climate change, biodiversity loss, and pollution, including in the oceans.
while improving the health of millions of people and addressing the drivers of environmental degradation. An adequately financed GEF-8 will advance these interconnections to create meaningful and sustainable social, environmental, and financial gains. The GEF funding unlocks larger investments and co-benefits, and this catalytic role was envisaged when the convention text was adopted. The convention tells us that domestic funding, bilateral and multilateral funding, and also private sector engagement will all play a key role in this effort, and GEF must realize its potential to unlock this. Excuse me. So one of my points today is that a significantly increased allocations for chemicals and waste is needed, and specifically to the Minamata Convention, as we are moving from enabling activities and proof of concept programs. Parties had a detailed discussion on GEF-8 at the online segment of COP4 in November, and thank you once again, Carlos Manuel, for your participation. I hope to see you and also welcome you to the second in-person segment of COP4 in March in Bali, Indonesia. The Secretariat shared party statements with GEF Secretariat and Council members. I urged parties at that meeting to engage in the national processes relative to the GEF and GEF operational focal points to ensure that the national needs related to the convention are fully known to the participants in the replenishment meetings. So this is the most important message I would like to send today to the countries too, to use your national processes on GEF replenishment to the fullest. We also had a lively side event on the financial mechanism at COP4, and I took away a number of messages. One is that we must make the science-based rationale for our work clear and accessible to a wide range of decision makers across ministries and a wide range of stakeholders. This is an issue that cannot be overestimated. Going forward into GEF-8, it will be important to carefully consider what the GEF projects will measure. This is the point that has already been brought by colleagues, and it will be important to share that information widely to demonstrate the success. We are now analyzing the first full national reports on the implementation of the convention that were due by the end of December last year. This will provide a great detailed information party needs that we can use to ensure that the GEF investments lead to effective, integrated, and inclusive responses that are well grounded in national initiatives and whole of the government approaches. We intend to be very active in feeding this information into the programming of GEF-8 resources. This information will not yet at that stage provide monetary value on domestic investment currently being undertaken that you are rightfully, Carlos Manuel, are calling for, but it will clearly indicate areas and countries where implementation has progressed well and issues where further efforts is needed. And this information, to my mind, is what any young convention like Minamata Convention should or would start with. Parties need to meet numerous time-bound obligations, which will be prominent in GEF-8, and this cut across many industrial sectors and product categories that are critical in the Build Back Better era. Let me give you an example. Our parties are required in Article 8 of the Convention to control emissions of mercury to air from coal-fired power plants, coal-fired industrial boilers, non-ferrous metal production, lead, zinc, copper, and industrial gold, cement production, and waste incineration. So you can see these sectors represent a sizable part of most countries' economies and are vital to everyday life. So what are parties required to do? They need to establish emission inventories no later than 5 years from when the country becomes a party, required to use the best available techniques and best environmental practices in new sources within 5 years, and for existing sources, implement control measures within 10 years. Another looming deadline is 2025, phase out of mercury-based chlorine and caustic soda production, alkali production. Facilities that use non-mercury processes are much more energy efficient than the outmoded mercury-based facilities. Yet some countries are facing financial barriers to achieving this switch, and many need also technical assistance to manage this transformation cleanly. And then there is our most famous sector, which is artisanal and small-scale gold mining. I'm very proud that the Global Mercury Partnership and the Minamata Convention have drawn needed attention to this sector, and the GEF has made great progress working with parties and mining communities through the Planet Gold program. The sector must continue to be addressed in a very thoughtful and careful manner to achieve full implementation of the convention. And this is for dozens of countries for whom this sector represents a real challenge, including impacts to vulnerable populations, including women and children and indigenous communities. Finally, I would be remiss not to mention mercury as a commodity chemical. It is stored, traded, and in some cases stockpiled. This can be well managed or poorly managed, and our parties very much would like to manage it well. They are very intent to eliminate illegal mercury trade, and this requires training and legal structures at the regional and national levels that are well integrated into the broader supply chain management efforts. So to have GEF aid to emphasize supply chains is a very welcome component. Several elements of the programming directions draft that will be finalized next month in the replenishment meetings are important to the Minamata Convention. Not only does the chemical and waste focal area needs to be fully resourced, but other focal areas and integrated programs should not waste any opportunity to address hazardous chemicals in relevant sectors. So thank you, Carlos Manuel, for highlighting this as well. To realize this in practice, I think a deeper knowledge in other areas of the value of chemical and waste should be promoted. I would like to wrap up by saying that the GEF Minamata Convention projects to date have achieved important and a very good result, and GEF 8 holds the promise to achieve even broader scale impacts. This work is worth more than every dollar of the investment that the world will make in GEF 8. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Monica, for at the beginning underlining the dual importance of sound and chemicals and waste management for health and nature, and then also underlining that the implementation of the Minamata Convention provides for significant overarching benefit. You're also underlining the catalytic role that the GEF is playing there, and the importance of domestic, multilateral, and private funding. And of course, the need for an increased GEF replenishment and the need to use also the domestic processes to achieve such an increased GEF replenishment. And again, you were underlining the need to understand and where progress and how progress was achieved. You were drawing attention to the specific obligations that the parties are having under the Minamata Conventions and the related needs. And at the end, you were also highlighting the important and good results of the GEF Minamata cooperation. Thank you very much. And with that, I would like to hand over to Sheila Agarwal, who is the Director of the Economic Division of UNEP, and where also the Secretariat is located. Over to you, Sheila.
Thank you, Franz. And thank you for having me at this event today. I see in our attendees list, we have almost 200 participants, of which many of them have been involved in the SciCam process. And as you know, this is a very important year for SciCam because we've had delays with having to be able to convene the meetings, and we're hoping to being able to resume with the at least IP4 and with any luck ICCM5 if we can meet physically. To really come together to agree on the kinds of targets and indicators that are going to be so critical for dealing with the pollution crisis. We've seen a lot of good work from the GEF in trying to support the SciCam process so far, but we've also seen, let's say, the SciCam process evolve quite a bit from looking at individual chemicals to now moving towards clusters of chemicals. But to be honest, it's a worry. You know, when I try to think, can any of us really say, do we have a safe, pollution-free environment that works for the economy? Or is it still the economy and the environment and human health all separate things? And while we've had some very good successes, we've seen some good work with POPs on the Stockholm Convention, and the plastic amendment coming through now with BRS. We're seeing good work on mercury. And then, Anil mentioned farm and some other work on, coming through on PFAS and all. But I really wonder if we're playing catch up constantly. I wonder if in 10 years from today, when we've all moved to other jobs, will we still have a pollution crisis? And I think we will, because I don't feel that we have managed to figure out what to do. We've got thousands of chemicals coming into the environment, and we deal with what we feel is the highest priority. But there's a zillion others coming in where we either don't know the environment and human health impacts, and we play catch up when we find out what it is, and then we try to address it. And, we've been having discussions with our partners in the IOMC partnership to think through really, and with the SciCam Bureau to think, is this the right way? Do we need to be looking at, instead of chemicals in clusters, which is very important, but maybe also to look at sectors and think, is this sector operating in the best way possible? And I'll give you an example. We have a very big transport mobility program, and it's pushing towards e-mobility. But then when you look at e-mobility and you think, well, wait a minute, we're going to have lots of mining on lithium. And what happens? Okay, lithium batteries will last longer than the lead acid batteries, and lithium is valuable, so it'll be recycled, but there are challenges with recycling it. And then what happens at the end? Do we have a pollution crisis on our hands, both at upstream and then further downstream when the batteries are no longer usable? We're seeing a huge issue with lead acid batteries. And, we've prioritized, other issues on lead. We have only a few countries working on lead acid batteries. And here we have lead impacts that are hurting the IQ of so many informal workers and their families. And so I wonder if, when we're looking at sectors, and I love the idea of the impact programs and the integrated programs, because I think that maybe we need to be looking at, how do we deal with some of these pollution crises that are coming through the sectors? If we're dealing with transport, are we looking at lead in lead acid batteries and lithium, and looking all the way across the value chain, upstream from mining to trying to get in a circular economy approach, so that at the end of the day, we don't have pollution in these sectors? Or will we stay dealing with little clusters of chemicals, which, while important and has a dent, don't get me wrong, it does have a dent in the whole system, but does it have a big enough dent that we're really addressing the issue? We're seeing that countries don't have the basic chemicals management capacities in place. And while the special program has also created some impact, and the GEF's enabling activities have created some impact, I wonder if we're really at the level where we can say, yes, all countries out there have enough of the basic chemical management systems and capacities that are not starting from scratch, because there's a lot of data out there on risks and all that could be harnessed, and that could really help some of the countries leapfrog to build better capacities. If we were to take an approach that really strengthens countries' basic capacities, plus looks at sectors, I think it would really complement some of the chemical specific work that is ongoing. And that maybe, in a handful of years, we would be able to say, actually, we've brought the pollution crisis to a level at where the climate crisis is. But right now, what I see is the pollution crisis is very far behind us. And in fact, most people don't even know that, the textiles that they use, the food they eat and all, they either don't know or don't know how to cope with it. And so for me, it would be a very interesting journey. And, Carlos, I'm always inspired when you speak, to seeing your leadership and how you push things, and you're really ready to break barriers, to really thinking, how do we make this pollution crisis something that will go to a very different height from where it is today. I feel our work on green chemistry also, we have the manual set up and all, but the key challenge is, okay, now how do we set in place a market that will really harness the opportunities in different sectors for green chemicals. And there was talk about the financing and how do we mobilize financing. And I think that, you know, between the GEF's catalytic financing plus whatever innovations in financing, this will be the key to unlocking how we deal with the pollution crisis. So I will stop there, but I just wanted to say that as we go forward with SciCam in this year, and as we move forward towards targets and indicators, I'm hoping that we will be able to really set in motion the enabling environment that really pushes the bar in ways that we haven't done so far, that we can break the boundaries that we have and really evolve SciCam in a way that with the GEF's support, we will be able to deal with this pollution crisis that we see. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Sheila, for first, of course, outlining that look chemical by chemical, that indeed has allowed to reduce pollution, but that chemicals and waste will remain the challenge, an important challenge for the future. You draw the attention to the very specific example of vehicles, of electronic vehicles, the batteries, and the challenge that might trigger with regard to the waste that is produced through these batteries. And therefore, you also draw the attention to the need to look at the bigger picture. And you also highlighted rightly that the integrated approach by the GEF has a potential to take that broader approach, looking at the big approach. You were also using the example that there is a need to have a sound waste management in place at the country in order again to look not only at chemicals and waste individually, but to a more comprehensive manner. And you were highlighting again the critical need of the GEF as a catalytic factor in order to address these elements, but also the need, of course, for additional support than the one by GEF. And finally, you were expressing the hope, which we all share, that SciCam will continue to allow us to take this comprehensive approach to chemicals management so that we can achieve also in the future a situation where this pollution challenge can be addressed effectively. Thank you very much to all the speakers. And that brings us now over to the discussion, to the interactive part of it. Before taking up some of the questions that have been posed and that Diana was sending over to me, I would like just to give back the opportunity to Carlos Manuel to react to some of the comments that were now made with regard to the expectations to the GEF and the GEF replenishment. Carlos, over to you.
Well, thank you so much. A couple of things here, Frank, are very important. One is, you know, Shaila's comments about the pollution crisis. It was very surprising to me to read this week that the Global Economic Forum Global Crisis Perception, where, you know, many environmental related elements were in the top 10 most severe risks at the global scale, but pollution was not brought there. Even though I strongly believe, and there's so much science that tell us that the pollution crisis at this point is stronger and more dangerous than probably the climate and even the biodiversity crisis. That means that, yes, we got a big challenge in front of us. The second element that I want to brought to your attention is the fact that, you know, Rolf told us about the $5 billion financial needs. I think that may be a very conservative number. Nevertheless, if we compare this with the global financial gap in terms of climate and biodiversity, this is very much within our reach. And if we really understand that if we invest in more policy coherence, which means that we need to really align all public and private investment with the conventions, the financial need would decrease dramatically, and a combination of a strategic mobilization of ODA plus domestic resource mobilization can be a way by which in the next decade we will go from what Shaila is telling us, catching up, with going ahead of the curve of the tendency. And that is a very important element. The third element is we will never mobilize domestic resources more efficiently. We will never have a higher impact with our limited ODA resources, if we keep on believing that the institutional framework that we have in place at the country level is the right one to achieve progress on chemicals and waste. And the case of Costa Rica is a good example of it. You know, chemical and waste is not an issue of the Ministry of Environment, it's an issue of the Ministries of Health and Agriculture. And I had never seen a minister or a vice minister in health or agriculture that knows about chemicals and waste. Or even having a vice minister as with an expertise on environmental engineer. They've been trained to promote business as usual in their sector, in the agricultural sector, and then on health, they are exclusively concentrated on human health, and they don't do the connection within human health and environmental health. So one element that is very important for us in GEF8 is working with the convention and the parties on how do we generate a political dialogue and discussions where we can, one, began conversations and political dialogues based on the fact that the same way that we need to fully use the market and the economic policies in our favor, we need to address the institutional failures, and we need to work on being able to go beyond the sectors and the silos, which is extremely important. That will give us a much better ground for action at the country level, because countries will understand that it's in their own self-interest to mobilize more efficiently domestic resources to avoid the very serious impact of pollution in human health and also in ecosystem health. So those two elements are important. So I believe that if we compare ourselves with the other environmental sectors and the financial challenges, I think it is within our reach in the next decade to be just catching up in terms of action and moving ahead of the curve. And that is why we have this approach in GEF8. Everything that we are proposing in GEF8 is because in GEF9, we got a good expectation that we will be ahead of the curve. Thank you.
Thanks, Manuel, Carlos. And with this, I would like just to take up the first question that was coming in from one of the participants, from Abdullah Al-Mogaki. And he's asking whether there's a place to support projects also from the Basel Convention, such for example, projects linked to e-waste by the GEF. So the GEF could also be a financial mechanism to support Basel projects such as e-waste. I think you, Carlos, again, are best positioned to answer that, but then I would also offer the floor to Rolf afterwards. So first over to you, Carlos, and then to Rolf.
Well, I will ask my colleague Anil to address this one because he knows much better this very specific field than me. Anil?
Thanks, Carlos, Manuel, and thanks, France. Thanks for the question. So in terms of the Basel Convention, I mean, as we know, GEF isn't a financial mechanism for that convention. However, several of the wastes that are captured under Basel fall under Stockholm and Minamata currently. E-waste is one of those, and we've had since GEF 5 into GEF 6 and now into GEF 7, and certainly into GEF 8 and 9, will be funding and have funded projects that address e-waste from the perspective of reducing emissions of unintentionally produced POPs and also some of the new POPs that are included in e-waste. And more recently, in GEF 7, some of these projects that we've funded take on aspects of trying to find circular solutions to addressing e-waste. So the answer is we funded under the mandate we have from the Stockholm Convention and under some aspects of SICOM as well, but unless Basel has the financial mechanism, then we won't fund it specifically under Basel. But we do certainly use the projects use the guidelines produced by Basel, so they're all consistent with the work coming out of that convention as well. So thank you.
Thanks, Anil. And Rolf?
Yes, thank you, Ambassador. Just to add that the Basel Convention is quite an old convention set up before the GEF, as far as I know, and as a result, it didn't, the parties did not appoint GEF because GEF did not exist at the time. And through the different conference of the parties, the Basel Convention established various mechanisms whereby to address electronic waste, and rightly so, electronic waste is now very much a top priority. So there are a number of decisions now going before Basel Convention to look at electronic waste in a greater way. Their proposal, in fact, from Switzerland as well. So we're looking forward to the next COP, and I'm hoping the parties will be giving some more attention and more importance to this very, very critical issue. I'll stop here. Thanks.
Thanks a lot. And as SAICM is one of the channels through which also e-waste projects can be funded, I just asked you, Sheila, do you also want to say something in response to that question?
Yeah, I think that, one of the, in fact, just this morning, I was wondering that, rather than looking at e-waste as a separate issue, I really wonder if we should be looking more at what does it mean in terms of a circular economy. And so that you start right from scratch to being able to design products that make it back into the economy, rather than having to deal with, of course, the waste at the end, and that it has value. I mean, it's something we're looking at with the whole plastics debate. And, as you know, governments are putting forward resolutions on having a global plastics agreement. So can we have just as the way we're looking at a circular economy for plastics, is how do you look at a circular economy where minerals and metals and other commodities are used in products so that they make it all the way back into the economy? And so it would be quite interesting to see as we go forward in the future, and if we're looking at items used in a particular sector which consumers are ultimately using, is what are the incentives in place to be able to bring back those products, and what kind of extended producer responsibility can be in place to be able to work from the producer side down to the consumer side and back into the economy to make these this whole system work in a very different way.
Thanks a lot, Sheila. And indeed, I think I remember also from the work in the Basel Convention that was also approach that the Basel Convention was taking. For example, in its mobile phone partnership, it wasn't trying to move towards circular economy and to minimize waste by not making sure that they do not exist at all. The second question we received from Hemsing Guryang from Mauritius is directed to you, Monica, and she's asking, you mentioned ASGM, which is indeed one of the success stories, important areas of the activities under Minamata. And the question is, how about mercury in dentistry? Dental amalgam is a big problem for developing countries, and how will Minamata try to address that difficulties and that problem?
Thank you so much, and thank you for the question as well. Well, the dental amalgam is regulated by the convention. More specifically, it is Annex A and Part 2, where parties are required to phase down the use of dental amalgam, and by doing so, they are required to take 2 or more of the specific measures listed in this annex. In one of the latest meetings at COP3, parties were also recommended to go beyond, so to take on more than the required number of measures on dental amalgam, and this is in order to speed up the phase down. So this is already covered, and there is a quite active exchange and ideas from parties how to make sure that dental amalgam is eventually phased out. As far as GEF projects are concerned, there are a number of GEF projects that address and give possibility for countries to address dental amalgam. There is one project involving WHO for African countries. There is also GEF 7 Islands program that which offers an entry point for small island developing states to address mercury added products, including thermometers and phasing out dental amalgam. So this opportunity could be used. And there are some ongoing projects within our smaller part of the financial mechanism, specific international program also to address this topic. So it is very much both on the programmatic level, but also political level being addressed by parties. Thank you for the question again.
Thank you very much, Monica. There's a third question which I received from Feng Wang, and this is a question for Jeff. I don't know whether you, Carlos, or Anil would like to respond to it. The question is whether there will be a major change of the global benefit indicators from GEF 7 to GEF 8 with regard to chemicals and waste management.
I will say that the change in the targets is just adding information to capture more data on a more granular level, particularly on POPs and mercury. What we have done in GEF 7 in terms of results is important. So we're not changing or adding new elements. What we want to have is a higher impact as well, and be able to generate much better data. But also, this is a great opportunity to need to complement with what has been also said previously with regards of how do we generate more impact with the limited resources. And you know, Monica, Rolf, and Sheila mentioned it many times. And this is very important in the context of what we aim in GEF 8. You know, the climate, biodiversity, and pollution crisis are not isolated events, situation, or challenges. They are all linked to this irrational, unsustainable consumption and production patterns by humans based on this irrational economic system. That is why, based on GEF 6 and GEF 7 experiences, we look for more integration. If you work with countries on dealing with climate change and biodiversity change, there will be benefits to other sectors. The climate and biodiversity benefit of fully engaging in dealing with chemical and waste is high, but we haven't been able to do it in a comprehensive manner. And this is the moment, because otherwise it will be catching up with all the challenges and the targets, as Sheila mentioned. So this is a great opportunity to be able to go beyond on what we've been doing in the past, really integrate, because we should be aiming to the root of the problem, not just the consequences of this. And this is a very important element. This will help us narrow the financial gap, the global financial gap, more quicker, position pollution in the front lines of sustainability, and help countries understand that it's in their own self-interest to be more consistent from the policy and the incentives point of view. Anil, I don't know if you want to add something else to this.
I think you captured it well. I mean, the GEF 7 indicators, co-indicators that we've developed captures very well the conventions that we cover. We do need a little more granularity, especially when it comes to products for the Minamata Convention, as well as the Stockholm Convention. So we'll actually split one of the indicators for this, but really it's in the quantum of the target that Carlos Manuel mentioned, that we expect, depending on the financial scenario, to go to 3 times to 4 times the level of ambition we've had in terms of results for the co-indicators that respond to the chemical and waste conventions. And it's important to see that we expect the focal area resources to directly contribute to those, but also to have co-benefits from the integrated programs, as well as the other focal areas into those, which allows the greater ambition. So it's not just chemical resources that provide these, it's the programming and ensuring that the programming that we do respond to all of the work on chemicals, particularly the other focal areas and impact programs. So thanks.
Thanks a lot. And just building on how you just well outlined also the need for integration and for having these indicators in order to understand whether we were performing well. Rolf was referring in his intervention to the need to measure the results and the impacts of the GEF, and to create perhaps also a group that could look at this, measuring at this information, the knowledge that is produced, in order to learn from that. What would you say to that from a GEF perspective, to this proposal to measure results and impacts of the GEF activities, and to create a group to build on that information to further enhance the performance and the cooperation between the GEF and the conventions?
We at the GEF, France, we welcome any initiative that can help us increase the measurement of what we do, but most importantly, increase the impact. We will continue having, core indicators that works on reduction, disposal, destruction, phasing out, elimination, avoiding, the chemicals. That won't change that much at all, but we need definitely support from all parties and stakeholders to help us measure the impact and aim for the very specific activities that can give us that. Our independent evaluators has recommended us to do that, so we welcome those initiatives that can really make us more efficient and more impactful.
Thanks a lot, Carlos. And I think that leads then over to the representatives of the convention and of SAICM, Rolf, Monica, and Sheila, because how, in that case, from your perspective, do you handle that, and how do you measure the impact to realize also what from the convention side can be done better in order to have more impact by giving the specific guidance to the GEF and so on? So what is, from your perspective, the suggestions with regard to measuring impact? Carlos, Rolf, do you want to begin first, and then Monica, and then Sheila?
All right. Yes, I was saying that we do have a reporting mechanism under the Stockholm Convention, as the other conventions as well. But one of the things that we note is that the reporting by countries is very, very low, which means that the Secretariat, and indeed the GEF, is not hearing what the countries' needs are. And countries see this as a burden, but I think it's very important that we can capture those needs and also expectations. I think that's the first point. The second point is, and I referred it extensively in my presentation, is that when we design the projects, really from the implementing agencies, they work with the different countries. But when it comes to pinpointing the actual impacts of these projects, especially in the integrated programming approach, it can be difficult because planting 100 trees, you can physically go and calculate how many trees you've planted, for example. But when it comes to chemicals, that can be quite complex in terms of how do we quantify and how we measure the impacts, whether it's been health improvements, whether it's been reduction in terms of cancers or other likely impacts of the particular chemical. We've seen in the past, for example, where the GEF has been instrumental in dealing with PCBs, for example, removed from transformers. We there have a global monitoring program, or the GMP. This is a network of monitoring stations around the world where we actually collect data in terms of persistent organic pollutants. And what we've seen is that the Stockholm Convention is indeed working, as we've seen some of these chemicals actually are reduced both in the atmosphere and in other media. So there is impact, being done through the work of the GEF, through the project. We just want this information to be focused when we actually prepare the different interventions at the national level. Thank you.
Thanks, Rolf. Monica.
Thank you so much also for possibility to contribute to this question. And maybe let me start by saying that it has been for quite already many years evident for many conventions, global conventions, and any policy framework that a robust indicator or follow-up system, which includes indicators, is important. And I think this is to avoid these open-ended processes where we are not able to demonstrate and deliver message to politicians that what you have invested brought the results that you were hoping for. And I think perhaps for the Minamata Convention, the young convention, with all this knowledge and experience, it's, I would say, relatively easy to think that this is what is being put in place, and we will have such a robust follow-up program or framework. But I would say for GEF as well, and I very much appreciate the effort and the work that is being done to put indicators in place. And I have to say that it would be basically quite encouraging to have an indicator on mercury on its own. I'm understanding that there is also much more consideration to this, but from our convention perspective, this would not only allow to demonstrate the contribution to global co-benefits, but would basically also encourage projects that are directly targeted to achieving a key result, and this is implementing the convention. Maybe a reflection overall about the creating an impact, and that's also in the context what Sheila rightfully mentioned, that on the governance side and currently looking at policy and legal frameworks we are having in place, well, this is perhaps not optimal. So this is a task for a global community to continuously evaluate and find better approaches that the chemicals and waste can be targeted to chemicals that are really of a major concern, and more completely, but also that there is a more integration and more opportunities to integrate where it makes sense. Still, I think the conventions are a good system to bet on, and this is because there is a massive ongoing processes within those conventions to draw parties' attention to particular issues. So there is the entire governance behind the convention, from reporting, from using every possible tool to support parties in implementation, to jointly look at the gaps, and to also exercise the political pressure to implement where implementation has to take place. So this, matched together with GEF as a financial mechanism, does create impact, because there is a process where attention of parties is constantly brought on, and there is also a mechanism to renew, to amend, and to fill in the gaps. So let's bet on the system we have, while also recognizing that this is a slice of a pie. There are other conventions than chemical and waste convention. Luckily, GEF have those in the portfolio, thus is in position to work on the integration as you do. And this opens up also for us in the convention the understanding what kind of contribution we need to make to make everyone aware how this integration can be done in the best possible way. And I would say that the major, of course, players in this regard are countries themselves and their capabilities to do so. But from us, from convention point of view, secretariat point of view, we will definitely follow and try to do the as best contribution as we can. Thank you.
Thanks, Monica. And then Sheila.
Thanks, Franz. So as you know, the SciCam process is setting up and discussing right now, in fact, the indicators and targets for the beyond 2020 timeline. And a lot of work has gone from the technical and virtual working groups on this. Some stakeholders have talked about, increasing the level of ambition so that it really measures whether we're solving the pollution crisis. The SciCam process is also setting in place a process to look at, to monitor the state of the targets and to look at the impacts. So there will be an impact assessment process that would hopefully then also be agreed to going forward. What will be really interesting is to be able to see whether in looking at these indicators, as Carlos said, in the GEF, you're looking at pollution reductions, but what would also be interesting to see in that indicator framework is it looking at also the extent to which, let's say a market for green and sustainable chemicals has been put in place, and the kind of incentives that are in place to create that market, to look and seeing how across sectors we're working and whether an integrated approach to chemicals is really working for the benefit of those actors in each sector, and then working across sectors at a government level to make things happen. So, but in summary, yes, SciCam will have a process in place that stakeholders have been discussing about how to monitor and look at the impacts in terms of pollution reduction. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. There's another question from Dr. Dada from Nigeria, an old friend and colleague of many of us. And Dr. Dada is asking whether there's a specific strategy by the GEF to encourage the active participation of the private sector in increasing funding to the chemicals and waste cluster. So what can the GEF do in order to trigger and active and increase the private sector contributions to funding for the chemicals and waste management policy? And I think that's a question to which each of you can answer. Perhaps you, Carlos, begin, and then I invite the others to complement also. Over to you,
Sure.
Carlos.
Yes, thanks so much, Ambassador, for bringing this question. This is very important because the chemical industry and the sector that use chemicals include the largest global companies with an extensive reach in almost every aspect of our lives. And it is not just now that we're focusing on the private sector. We've been working with them ever since the beginning of all the actions with relation with all the conventions. So this is not new to us. But I think that we have covered many grounds. I mean, the way that we have been able to engage with a large and very diverse industry with a multi-stakeholder approach and platform can address the goals of the conventions, the concerns of the marketplace, the investors' aspiration for sustainability, but most importantly, the aspiration of policymakers. The platforms that we've been engaged, like, I don't know, Planet Gold, the Global Mercury Partnership, the renewable bioeconomy platforms of the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, the WEF. All of that is great. All of that is great. But at the end of the day, what we need to really understand are what is the data and information that policymakers need to have so they can, on one side, begin addressing the lack of the right policies and incentives and dealing with perverse incentives at the same time. We don't need to go further to really understand what works and what doesn't work. Let's look at what has happened in CBD and biodiversity in the last 3 or 4 years. There's a lot of very good economic information about the benefits of protecting nature, about the benefit of restoring nature, on the return on investing in protecting, in the good management of protected areas and restoring the landscape. That has really changed the mindset of many decision makers in the public sector with regards to the need to protect biodiversity, because it does underpins the global economic system. In the chemical and waste sector, we haven't done that. On the contrary, the information is being used to continue business as usual, and I have seen it in my country, many other countries, where the decision makers doesn't have the right information, and that is why it has been so difficult to engage them in ways that they can help us really understand that business as usual is not an option, and there are many ways by which we can do this. And politicians normally see this as a sector somewhere there, down there, that needs to deal with all these, hazardous chemicals. It is not there at the level of what CBD, biodiversity, and climate change it is right now. And that is basically because the economic information is not being provided. If we put a simple data like the cost of not taking action with regards to the Chemicals and Waste Convention, I think that things can change. So we encourage from the GEF that kind of information in the context of the many different platforms that we work with, and we look forward to be able to provide that data in ways that can help us upscale the action, but in the context of a good understanding on how development policies can help across climate change, biodiversity, land degradation, and yes, of course, chemicals and waste.
Thanks. Thanks, Carlos. And we will also invite the representative from SAICM and Minamata and BRS to respond to that question. So first to you, Sheila, then to Monica, and then to Rolf. Sheila?
Thanks. Franz, I missed the question. Could I trouble you to repeat it again?
The question is what can be done in order to encourage private sector to mobilize more for the chemicals and waste management issue.
Okay, good. So in fact, very interesting, we've started having discussions with the chemical associations to see what would work for them in, let's just say, on plastics. And to me, it's not about, how much money are they willing to contribute as grant funding. I think that would be just like a little piece of nothing really. But it's about the financing in a very different way, because it's about how does sustainability work for them so that their shareholders, their consumers of goods and services are willing to pay, whether it's a premium or willing to even just engage and invest because they see sustainability at its core. And, we're seeing this in many different spheres of our work. We're seeing it in the mining sector. We're seeing it in the transport sector, in the plastics area, where multiples, whether it's consumers or investors, want to see sustainability. And I think that is a key issue, is to innovate with the industry players to seeing what will work for them that will also be able to create a positive environment and health benefits, so that we are not in a situation where it's always, okay, don't do this and don't do that. But it's really about, in a way, if you look at the Montreal Protocol, how did it reach such a success was because there were already alternatives that were available, and then the chemical industry could really take the advantage of let's say, the potential of a market that was going to be created by having targets in place on ozone depleting substances. And we should be thinking about, yes, what would help the industry be able to shift and transition its practices in ways that really will create benefits for the industry, but at the same time address the pollution crisis that we see.
Thanks, Sheila. Then over to you, Monica, followed by Rolf.
Well, thank you so much. And maybe to start with, GEF support is not, of course, to take place of the private sector investments, but to catalyze the right kind of investments. And to give an example, we have had a very strong engagement of private sector in efforts to eliminate mercury in chloralkali industry. So there is one sizable GEF project in Mexico to do this with a strong private sector engagement. And definitely this is quite essential to the success of the convention. If I may refer to what you, Carlos, Manuel, were talking about, I could not agree more with the need to have the right economic information, more specifically on evaluation of the benefits of implementation and also the cost of inaction. The GEF and we all can play a crucial role in integrated ecosystem values in business plans through such information. And I know that there is one tool or system called ENCORE under UNEP umbrella that exactly aims to do that, integrating the cost of drivers of environmental degradation, including mercury and other chemicals, into business planning and actions. And this is linked also to this integration between different ministries, but also engaging private sector and I would say it would be just excellent if we can advance in this area, and I really hope we within convention could do our bit in this regard. Thank you.
Thanks. Rolf?
Thank you very much, Ambassador. I would share a couple extra points from colleagues. The first one, I think, is we see a number of private sector initiatives being launched, being in the media and everything, but we are not measuring the effectiveness of these private sector initiatives. We do not know whether they are actual initiatives in themselves, or they just marketing blurbs, or just to improve the image of the company, or whether there is substantive impact from those private sector initiatives. Yes, there are some labels, there are some medals, there are some indicators and indexes that's being used, but I think we need to further develop this in a more transparent and an accountable way. If my friend from the rapporteur on human rights will be here, he will be mentioning about the importance of transparency and accountability in the reporting of both the products that those companies and services provide, but also in the home to the BRS conventions. The first one is, of course, we have a number of initiatives under the Basel Convention for chips. We've had one for the e-waste. We've had a new one now with the plastic waste. We have a domestic waste partnership. All these are designed to enable engagement with the private sector. And there's been some great success, but also some important lessons learned in some of the other initiatives. Definitely we can do more, and I think we should explore more mechanisms where we can mobilize adequate resources. And one of these areas, for example, we've seen it in energy. Because there's a return of investment in energy, we have a lot of philanthropic or what we call a social investment or impact investments. This is an area which I think is still untapped in the chemicals and waste sector. It is growing in such as that, and I think it's an area where we can explore, where we can engage with the private sector, engage with financial institutions in mobilizing resources to address these environmental challenges, but in a positive economic way, because impact investing requires that you return some of those benefits back to those investors. But I think there are some great examples that we can come up and do some pilots and see how they can work in practice. The final point I wanted to make, I lost it now. It's Friday afternoon with the private sector. I'll come back later if I remember. Yeah. Over to you, Franz.
Thanks, Rolf. You're referring to the Special Rapporteur on Toxic and Human Rights, who is, by the way, attending also the seminar, and he would certainly agree with you that information is absolutely critical in order to bring us to move forward. There's another question which I would like to ask you, all of you, and then we are coming closer to an end. This is a question from Dixon Hall, and he's referring to the fact that the conventions and the GEF are having a focus on global benefits, targets, and indicators, which really in the chemicals and waste area are focusing on some very specific chemicals, such as POPs and mercury. Whether with such a narrow approach, how can it be possible to achieve, to address effectively the triple planetary crisis, especially the pollution crisis, when the chemicals and waste issue is looked at only through that narrow focus on mercury and POPs, and not through a broader picture, like as done, for example, in the biodiversity or the climate change convention?
Thank you, Franz, for that question. These questions really take us to the core of what we are aiming in GEF 8 and what we want to upscale in GEF 9, which is the full integration of the GEF resources. Up to now, the level of possibility for countries to use in a more flexible way star resources from the focal areas and the possibility to integrate more specific topics with focal areas was has been quite limited, and we aim for more flexibility to provide more flexibility in the use of resources so projects can address multiple sectors, multiple conventions, and with this we will optimize and maximize resources, look for higher impact. Additional to the fact that we look in GEF 8 and GEF 9 to really concentrate in generating more political consistency in the country development policies, and also help them mobilize domestic resources more efficiently, because we can double and triple the funding for the different conventions. That will never be enough to narrow the global financial gap. So a combination of more policy coherence, more political consistency, breaking the silos across sectors, helping countries understand how much money they are being investing in chemicals and waste, what are their needs, and coming with financial plans to narrow down that through a mix of mobilizing more efficiently domestic resources, more ODA, and better planning and budgeting across sectors is extremely important. So again, we aim in GEF 8 and yes, in GEF 9 to continue to address the root case of the problem, not just the symptoms. And we welcome this opportunity to really go beyond a specific convention and specific sectors, as we got this very clear challenge in front of us.
Thanks. Yes,
Franz, if I may, just to compliment one over very quickly.
Go ahead. Go ahead.
I mean, the chemical conventions, yes, they do cover specific set of chemicals, but we use them as an entry point to working, as I said, on broader sound management of chemicals and waste, but more so in terms of the design of projects and programs in GEF 7, but certainly in GEF 8 as well, where we've been able to capture multiple benefits for different environmental aspects. So, for example, working on the agriculture sector and chemicals, we've been able to look at improvements in land degradation and water use and management and other things. Similarly, looking at the gold sector, we've been able to also not only capture mercury reductions, but also looking at child labor improvements in land degradation there as well. So it's a question of how we report those, and we've started to be more deliberate in when we report to conventions, in particular in the chemicals one, indicating where the synergies are for the chemical conventions, not only within the cluster, but throughout the GEF, and you'll see those in the most recent corporate reports. So thanks.
Thanks a lot, Daniel. And we are slowly coming towards the end of this Gen event. I would like just to give to each of you again the floor for some final comments. It's just in the other order than at the beginning. So giving first the floor to Sheila, Monica, Rolf, and then Anil, and finally to Carlos, so that you could just make some final comments, and perhaps also again pick up that issue of the need on the one side of an integrated approach in order to reflect that we need to have a broader perspective, but at the same time also the need not to lose the specific perspective while having a too broad perspective. Then I would like to give, as indicated, first the floor to you, Sheila, followed by Monica, Rolf, Anil, and Carlos. Sheila, over to you.
Thank you, Franz. As I said in the beginning, I think that one of the key issues is how do we move the pollution crisis dialogue and attention for it in the same way that we have for the climate crisis. If we achieve that, I think then just being aware and understanding that chemicals can be part of a different economy, as opposed to something that is, always in the negative, and for which most people are not even aware of the kind of damages that or risks that they're facing, not just to the environment, but for human health and the labor safety issues, for example. I think what will be really important is, as we look at particular clusters of chemicals that need to be reduced or eliminated, what will be very important is to take that integrated approach that you just, in fact, were mentioning again, and seeing what will it mean for countries to have very solid chemicals management capacities in place, so that when we look at different sectors and across sectors, chemicals can be managed in ways that are not always playing catch up, but that really the kinds of chemicals being used are part of a circular economy, whether you're looking at the whole movement to e-mobility, whether it's textiles, and that there is really, it is responding to a growing call from shareholders and consumers to have sustainability becoming embedded in it. You know, with our finance initiative, we've seen lots of banks and institutional investors really pushing to seeing sustainability at the core of what they invest in. And we're seeing a growing part of a number of types of shareholders asking for that in many sectors and for many of the commodities and services. So we're hoping that we can use this year and the future to be able to work with all our different stakeholders and partners to shift the focus in this more integrated manner going forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sheila. And then over to you, Monica.
Thank you so much, and allow me for this final remark, which is very much linked to, it's a little bit about the dilemma that due to limited resources, one can spread them rather thinly over many topics, or then concentrate on certain priorities. And this is a dilemma that I think GEF is tackling very well, because on one hand, we want to be credible with the work within the convention and the role that GEF plays as a financial mechanism. We want to deliver to not only be credible, but also inspire that there could be possibly the scope of the chemicals and waste and their legal regulation globally could be deepened or expanded. This credibility, with my own professional experience, is extremely important. But then we don't want to lose what we already know of the world, that there has to be more integration synergies and additional approaches done. So specifically on integrated programs that are being now shaped by the GEF, my message and takeaway is that I would really like to give more confidence to everyone that through the convention and the conventions and chemical and waste cluster, we can significantly actually contribute and produce benefits in these integrated programs, and through that confidence also enable or promote this idea among parties themselves. So this is something that currently I see a little bit of hesitation. For example, there are two specific integrated programs on food systems and Amazon and critical forest biomes. And I take it again as a task on ourselves to show and demonstrate that there is a knowledge already existing how implementation of chemical waste actually contribute to those areas quite strongly. So I end with that, and thank you so much for inspiring and very good discussions. Thank you.
Thanks, Monica. And over to you, Rolf.
Thank you very much. Just because I've heard this comment before, so I just wanted to put it into the context that the conventions deal with only a few chemicals, and indeed this is correct. But the issue is there are very limited mechanisms available now at the international level to really address some of these global issues, which is one is the absolute regulatory approach, which means that we ban, we control, and regulate. The other one is voluntary. And when we speak to the private sector, they want voluntary mechanism. We speak to certain groups, they want voluntary mechanisms, but then it doesn't happen. So when voluntary mechanism doesn't happen, then you need to have a regulatory framework under which the rights of people, the health of people, the health of our planet can be protected. And when it comes to then a regulatory requirement, then we enter into the complexity of regulating chemicals. And while some groups of chemicals may be easy to regulate because the whole group is toxic, we find that some groups of chemicals, only one or two of the chemicals within that group is toxic. So which increases the technicalities involved in this. And then the second point is, of course, you need to do the research, you need to provide the scientific evidence, and then it has to have the policy interface. This is where you looking at how countries can deal with the listing. For example, if it's a ban, how there will be a transition to new alternatives. And that was the point I wanted to raise under the private sector, is we also want to engage the private sector in looking for alternatives, cost-effective alternatives, sustainable alternatives, green alternatives, because it's not only financial resources, but it is also innovation and research and development that needs to move us away from those chemicals that are damaging to health and the environment. And we need to make investments in those. And these are rightly made in universities, in industry, where they invest in research and development. And we're seeing that even now with the plastic industry, where there's a lot of innovations happening. The final point I wanted to say is, I wanted to stress the importance of the science policy interface. And this is where I go to my colleague Sheila with the work of SciComm. And I think it's an important, we have a resolution before UNIA to for this interface, which will enable the whole community, the UN community and other international organizations, to look at a much wider group of chemicals and to look at it in a very integrated way, and also linking it with the other key global issues such as biodiversity and climate change. So finally, Ambassador, thank you so much for moderating. Thank you to my colleague panelists, and a special big thank you to Carlos Manuel from the GEF for taking his time to having this very engaging discussion with all, and to Jen as well. Thank you. Over to you, Ambassador.
Thanks a lot, Rolf. And with this, I hand over to Anil and Carlos for their closing words.
Thanks, friends, and thanks, colleagues. Just quickly, we've had good success in addressing chemicals and waste and cleaning them up over the last 30 years or so. But the important ambition now is that we must prevent harm from occurring from these hazardous chemicals. And so, history has shown us that once humans and ecosystems are polluted, there's a very slow no recovery from this harm. And so the work we have been doing and plan to advance on is getting ahead of the use of hazardous chemicals through cleaning up global supply chains, by employing green and sustainable chemistry and circular economy approaches, so that in 10 years, and to answer Sheila's question and concerns, our successors can say that we're well on the way to a pollution-free world. So I mean, at the GEF, at least from the hat I hold at the GEF, I hope to be able to continue to support countries in their work on this important issue, and look forward to working with Rolf and Monica and Sheila as we move on into the COPs this year, as well as the conclusion of the GEF 8 replenishment occurs. So thanks, and over to Carlos, and thanks for the invitation.
Thanks, Anil. The chemical and waste strategy in GEF 8 is it's very significant and more ambitious in three different ways, with regards to the structure, with regards to resources and results. The strategy is structured to build on the trend of GEF 6, GEF 7, and promote more integration, as we said throughout today's exchange, and also take a more kind of upstream supply chain approach to prevent the future buildup of harmful chemicals, and to avoid being in this situation of catching up, as Sheila just mentioned. So in GEF 9, we will be ahead in our aspirations, goals, and targets. Also, the GEF 8 chemicals and waste, we, as we said, will be integrating into a suite of integrated programs. I mean, at higher ambition that could be achieved through any single focal area. So that is a big move into scaling up, being more impactful with limited resources. So we're very, very excited, and we encourage parties to the conventions to be very focused and clear on the mandate that the GEF will receive to help them assist implementing their goals and targets with the different conventions. With this, I would like to thank France, to you and to our colleagues from the Chemicals and Waste Cluster for this great event. I wish we had the same thing with CBD, UNFCCC, and UNCDD as well, because this is extremely, extremely useful in the context of what we aim for GEF 8. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Carlos. And I would like just to build on your last comment. Yes, we have to make sure that we have even more impact with the limited resources, but the GEF 8 replenishment will of course also be a possibility to make sure that we have a little bit more of these limited resources in the past. And that's the reason why we, at least for Switzerland, look forward and really hope that the GEF 8 replenishment will allow for an increased replenishment. And Switzerland has a mandate and is ready to increase its contribution to the GEF. I think this discussion has really shown very well how important it is that we have a good relationship between, on the one side, the GEF as a financial mechanism, and on the other side, the conventions and CICM and the political area where the policies are formulated and the needs are formulated and the strategies are formulated as needed in order to achieve what we all want together to address the global challenges, the global crises which we are facing, and to make sure that the world is more sustainable and is better and is healthier. So thank you very much for that very rich and very good discussion. To a big thanks, of course, to the GEF Secretariat in Washington, to Anil and Carlos, but also to the representatives from the Chemicals and Waste Cluster in Geneva, Rolf Payet, Monica Stunkirich, Sheila Agarwal, representing CICM, which is also in Geneva. And last but not least, a very big thank and warm thank to the GEN for organizing that event, and thanking the GEN, the Geneva Environment Networks, means, of course, thanking you, Diana Rizzotto, and your team, and a very big thank for organizing that event. And with that, I would like just to hand over to you, Diana, so that you can announce some upcoming events organized by the GEN. Thank you very much to all, and also to the audience.
Thank you very much, Franz, also for moderating excellently this event, and for your continued support to the Geneva Environment Network. A quick announcement, 2 events upcoming next week. One is also linked to the pollution agenda. It's one of our Geneva Big Plastic Pollution Dialogues, which would look at the financial aspects of that would be needed if we have this new global agreement on plastics. It's taking place on Tuesday at 2 p.m. and also in preparation of the Convention on Biological Diversity subsidiary meetings that are supposedly taking place in Geneva in March. We're hosting a session looking at the place of disaster risk reduction in those negotiations, and that event is taking place on 20 of January, and we look forward to have our audience back for those 2 events. Thank you all very much. And just to remind you that, as it was mentioned in the chat, the summary, the video of the event, the links that were mentioned throughout the discussions will be posted on the webpage of the event. Thank you very much.